Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for today's webinar, hosted in partnership with the Office of Sustainability and the Office of Indigenous Engagement. We are so excited and honored for Melanie to be here with her special presentation. My name is Alana Dawn. I'm the Sustainability Partnerships and Events Coordinator with the Office of Sustainability. This event is in partnership with the Office of Sustainability's Climate Conversation Series, as well as it's the final event of the Office of Indigenous Engagement's Indigenous Knowledge Lecture Series. And I would love to introduce you to my friend Gerald Ratt, who will introduce himself further, and he'll be moderating the conversation with Melanie today.
Thank you, Alana Dawn. Okay, Denatida, Ambawa Stitch, Tanashi, Tanse, hello and welcome. I would like to introduce myself in my Cree language. Tansigwa Nichiwaganak Midagisagao Tapwimadasin. Gerald Nisithigasun, Mr. Hasagaigan Uchinida. My income tax name is Gerald Ratt. I'm Woodland Cree. I am a member of the Lac La Ronge First Nation on Treaty 6 territory. My Blackfoot name is Asuwu. I am the Indigenous Initiative Specialist here at the University of Calgary, working under the Office of Indigenous Engagement. The University of Calgary values the parallel process of cultural protocol, including gifting and honorarium. We have provided broadcloth and tobacco to our speakers. And I would like to take a moment to thank both Florence and Melanie for being here to share their knowledge and wisdom with us. I'll pass it over to Alana Dawn once more.
Thank you, Gerald. I'd like to take this moment to acknowledge the Treaty 7 territory. The University of Calgary, located in the heart of Southern Alberta, both acknowledges and pays tribute to the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the Siksika, Niigani, the Kainai, and Tsuut'ina First Nation, the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. Acknowledging the land is an important part of reconciliation to honor Indigenous cultural practices and help build respectful relationships. Understanding the concept of colonialism and its impacts is essential to the process of reconciliation. Impacts of colonialism have included dispossession from land, attempted cultural erasure through residential schools, Indian Act policies, and the ongoing crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and Two-Spirit. Colonialism continues to inflict ongoing injustices on Indigenous communities. It is at the root of many wicked problems. We are committed to changing these deeply embedded colonial behaviors, ideas, and systems to build healthy reciprocal relationships and to take meaningful action towards reconciliation. Indigenous worldviews, knowledges, languages, and culture, ways of doing and being are vital to addressing these systemic wicked problems. We express our deep gratitude and respect for Indigenous people's leadership, land stewardship, and sharing their wisdom, values, and teachings. We are very honored and grateful to learn from Melanie Goodchild today.
To help us start this webinar in a good way, I would like to introduce and welcome Anishinaabe Elder Florence Kelly to lead us in an opening blessing.
Hi. Should I speak now?
Yes, Florence, thank you for being with us.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I can get a little bit of a picture in the corner, but anyway, I know you can see me and hear me. So I'm happy to be here today. And I will say, I'm doing a smudge right now. I put on with my 4 sacred medicines. It's cedar and sweetgrass, and sage and tobacco. So we use those to smudge ourselves to clear the room of negativity around us, and we smudge our head first, because we thank the Creator for our to make our minds clear and to give us a good mind today. And we smudge our eyes to see the great things that the Creator has given us We have a beautiful place to live here in Canada. And then we smudge our mouth so that we always speak the truth and honest with our presentation and our talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Florence, for opening us up and starting us off in a good way with the blessings and smudge. I wish you a good day, Florence. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerald. Thank you, everyone. Miigwech. Thank you.
Thank you, Florence. Melanie shares about the importance of Indigenous knowledge and Western ways of knowing, and why this pathway is vital for all of us to build a more sustainable future. So I really love how the Office of Sustainability and the Office of Indigenous Engagement have been like building relationships and hosting this event together in partnership with both of our speaker series. Just to share, the Climate Conversation Speaker Series aims to engage the Calgary community and Albertans in transformative conversations on climate action. So I'll pass it over to you, Gerald.
Thank you, Alana Don. The Office of Indigenous Engagement, supported by U Calgary's Indigenous Strategy, ETOPITOP, created the Indigenous Knowledge Lecture Series to provide a public platform that welcomes thought-provoking Indigenous thinkers, leaders, scholars, artists, and knowledge keepers who are key in sparking community conversations that increase intercultural capacity. The series provides the campus community, community partners, Indigenous communities, and allies the opportunity to build good relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in what we call Canada. We are thrilled to have Melanie Goodchild here to share a story and presentation titled Niigani Miinigowiziiwin. We give these gifts to the future. She is Moose Clan, Anishinaabe Kwe, from Dugan Nishinabek and Gitagon ZB First Nations in Northern Ontario. She is a PhD candidate in social and ecological sustainability at the University of Waterloo and a systems thinking and complexity science scholar. Her presentation will describe how to heal self and systems through Miinigowiziiwin story and about her apprenticeship and complexity anchored in the principle of Gitawindamin, we are all related. She will be discussing an Anishinaabe approach to systems thinking and complexity science. Please join us in welcoming Melanie Goodchild. Thank you, Melanie. I just want to also remind the audience, if you have any questions or comments for our speaker, please use the Q&A feature on the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to answer as many as we can. Thank you. Over to you, Melanie.
Miigwech. Bonjour and Duk. Apajigo Miigwech Bizin Dawiyag. I said greetings to my relatives and thank you for listening. Miigwech to Florence, who's from my one of my home territories in Treaty 3, for starting us in a good way. And miigwech to the team who sent me this gift, the cultural protocol, which in the initial invitation to join you today in Circle, kind of got my attention in the following of protocols. And so this is really appreciated. And I have this here with me as I speak to you, which includes some sema, some tobacco. So I'm going to introduce myself according to our protocols, and then I will translate some of that for you, not all of it, but some of it. And I don't speak my language fluently. My dad went to Indian residential school at Spanish. My mom went to Indian day school in her community, and I was sent, you know, to the classroom with the intent to learn English. And I did that very well. I studied very well. And continued to be what I feel like is a professional student for most of my adult life. But I will share with you some of our protocols before I talk about the story, the Miinigowiziiwin that I'm going to share. So I'd like to acknowledge Treaty 7, Tansei, Oki, I have actually had the opportunity and honor of visiting Siksika, Kainai, Stony Nakoda, and Sutina before, so I feel like I'm kind of there with you virtually. As I said, Bonjour and Dino Maganaduk, Wabshkeo Gitchida Quays and Nung Indigenous cause, Waba Nung a Quay Indigenous cause, Moose and Dodem, Bigtagong Nishnabig and Donjaba, Kitagon Zibi and Donjaba, Melanie Indigenous cause, Jaganashi Ayung. In English, I'm called Melanie, named after my dad, my late father, Delaney, who was Moose clan, and so Moose and Dodem, that's my clan, and my mom, Melinda. They halved it up and spelled it like Melanie, but it's pronounced Melanie. My mom is Mung, which is Loon. She's Loon clan. My dad was from Bigtagong, Nishnabig, which is on the shores of Lake Superior, about 4 hours from here, where I am right now. And my mom's from Miinigowiziiwin. So Miinigowiziiwin is the Creator's Garden, or Garden River First Nation, and it's right here, about 5 minutes up the road from where I am. I'm in Bawating, which is the place of the rapids, known as Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario. This is part of the Three Fires Confederacy. This is the Anishinaabe, the Potawatomi, and Odawa. So I moved back home here within the last year, and before that I was in Southern Ontario and studying at the University of Waterloo. As Gerald mentioned, it's part of my journey is what I'm going to share with you today, this learning journey that I'm on. And being home here has been kind of a dream come true. We really wanted to come home to our traditional territory. I also have two grandmothers that are from different First Nations that I'd like to acknowledge. My grandmother, late grandmother on my dad's side, Isabella Miinigowiziiwin, was from Arrowland in Treaty 9. And my late grandmother on my mom's side, my maternal grandmother, was from Treaty 3, which is also where Florence's community is. And I have family there in Miinigowiziiwin. My grandmother was from Couchiching First Nation. And so that tells you a little bit about who I am and my background. I've always worked in support of our communities. I was a youth activist taking on racism and systemic racism in Thunder Bay, where I went to high school. And I won the Ontario Native Women's Association Youth Award when I was 15 or 16 years old because I wrote a little booklet. I photocopied it and I bound it on a machine, and it was introducing high school teachers to our culture as Anishinaabe people, Ojibwe peoples, because in my school, in my education, I never really learned anything about us. And it was like we weren't, even still there. And yet we were in very sacred territory there with Nanabojo, the sleeping giant, Mount McKay, this sacred mountain. So I wanted my teachers to know that they had students like me, that I wasn't seeing myself. Interestingly enough, through my undergraduate degree in sociology and then my master's degree in sociology, it was still the same. I wasn't really seeing not only information or content about us, but the ways that we learn. I wasn't seeing that reflected in reading books, and I'm pretty good at reading books. I enjoy that, and writing, but I felt like that things would change, especially after we saw the publication of Linda Tuani Smith's book about decolonizing methodologies. And that came about just as I was wrapping up my master's degree. So I was really excited to see, what was happening in higher education after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. But I also saw in my program, which is a PhD in social and ecological sustainability, a continued lack of awareness, content, pedagogy, different ways of learning, multiple ways of knowing. I didn't really see that reflected in what I was learning. My program tends to be very science oriented, and I'll tell you a little bit about that as I share my story. But first, what I'd like to do is, my dissertation is a fairly standard dissertation in the sense that it's 8 chapters, almost 300 pages, dozens and dozens of pages of references. But really what it culminates in is this story, this Gakikwewinan that I'm going to read to you. So I'm going to share my screen. This story is actually on my website, so it's fairly easy to find, and that's what I'm going to share first. This art is by Ocean Kiena, who's a young Anishinaabe artist from my dad's community, from Bigtagong, Anishinaabe. She does beadwork, she makes ribbon skirts, and she's a graphic illustrator. So you can click here when you go to my website, which is just MelanieGoodchild.com, and there's a flip book that you can view. But I'm going to share the story with you here. I'm going to read it. You can click down here to hear me read it, and I think you can download an info sheet if you want to share it with folks. This is just offered as a gift to people. It's based on my doctoral dissertation, and I'll tell that story after in a separate presentation. So I'll start by telling you this story and invite you to pour yourself a cup of tea and relax, because this story takes about 10 minutes to share. So. This is a story about Niigani Miinigowiziiwin. We give these gifts to the future. A story of how our ancestors walk with us during our apprenticeship with complexity, by Melanie, and illustrations by Ocean Kiana. Acknowledgements. I would like to acknowledge and credit my sister and brother-in-law, Eleanor Skeed and Bert Landon, Anishinaabe knowledge keepers and language speakers, for their teachings, love, and support of me during my journey. Eleanor's spirit names are Ogema Aganuk, Queen of the Stars, and Pikwana Katuk, Round Cloud Woman. Her Dodam clan is Num, Sturgeon. Wajushkunagam Ojaba, she is from Wajushkunagam. Bert's spirit name is Ga Gig Nodin, Everlasting Wind, and his Dodam is Piju, Lynx. Iskatawe Ga Gigan, number 39, Ojaba. He is from Shoal Lake, number 39. Eleanor acknowledges and credits her grandparents, Bill Skeed, Julia Skeed, nee Bluebird, and Agnes Canton, nee McGillis. Bert acknowledges and credits his grandparents, David and Mary Kijik, nee Green. Wabshkeo Gitchada Kwez Anung Indigo Anishinaabe Mung Adash, and Waba Anung Ekwe Indigo Anishinaabe Mung Adash. Those are my two spirit names, what I'm known by the spirits in Ojibwe. Mose and Dodem, I'm Moose clan. I was born into this clan through my dad Delaney. Ni Mama, my mother Melinda, is Hmong, Loon clan. Bigtagong Nishnabeg in Donjaba and Kirigonzibi in Donjaba. Nishnabeg Kweyanda, I am an Anishinaabe woman. Melanie Goodchild, Indigenous Knowledge Lecture Series is what I'm called in English, and I would like to acknowledge and credit my mother and late father for all they gifted me throughout my life. In Miinigowiziiwin, in our culture, Ojibwe culture, teachings, customs, and history, there are three kinds of stories. There's Adzukan, a sacred story, a spirit being. There's Debajimowin, a personal story. And there's Gakikwewin, a teaching or high-level teaching. I am sharing my Gakikwewin with you. It is called Niigani Miinigowiziiwin. We give these gifts to the future. These Anishinaabe stories are gifts, and all gifts are about healing. Somewhere along the line, the type of systems thinking and complexity science that I studied and teach is going to be healing for somebody. I am Oshkabewis, a traditionally trained apprentice, a helper, and spirit beings help me on my journey. This is Gakui Kwe Winan, the act of giving out the teachings. It is the story of my apprenticeship with complexity and the helpers I met along the way. The work of doing systems change is about clearing the path for those to come. Your turtle rattle, Melanie, the spirits wake up when they hear it, when they hear us pray, because they hear our distress. The real change begins when the spirits start doing their work. Eleanor Skeed. This Gakwikwewanan is an invitation. You may not find answers to questions you are holding, but you will walk with company. On a collective wisdom journey, under a canopy of tall birch and cedar trees, alongside a winding river, you will meet many beings. They are our helpers. They will support you during your apprenticeship with complexity. They know about the love you have for the beings in the future. These helpers will tell you stories to help you make sense of the world and remind you of Gedina Windamin. We are all related. Bonjour and greetings, my relatives. That's you and the tea leaves too. Bean again, come in. Welcome to the Wigwam Lodge. Sit and enjoy a nice hot cup of Nibi Chabot tea with me. For knowledge and medicine to enter, we humans need something physical, food or drink, says Eleanor. During my apprenticeship with complexity, I met Mushkiki 1, medicines, of grandmother cedar and grandfather birch. Eleanor says Mushkiki, medicine. I've always looked at it in a broader way. It wasn't only a physical structure, it was also the teachings themselves, because once they came to life, even our knowledge is Mushkiki. That's how I've always looked at it. I spent time at Nawe Aki, middle ground, in the magical space in between things. Through Manitukewinan ceremonies, I crossed thresholds into the spiritual realm, and in that sacred place, I was gifted a Miiganaak Shishigwan, turtle rattle, for my bundle. What will the Manadug spirits gift to you to help you on your journey? Sit by the Ishkade fire and offer your Sema tobacco, for this is our way to communicate with the Manadug. Eleanor says the fire itself is a guide and support on your journey. Petition the Manadug spirits for help on your journey. Pay attention to your Bawajiganan, your dreams. Your dreams and visions are Debwe truth. Bert says it's all about teaching. Even if a gift is given through dreams or through ceremony, it's a teaching for the next generation and the next generation. Ashkabewasug helpers are traditionally trained apprentices, ceremonial attendants. In a journey towards systems change, we are the helpers and our ancestors walk with us. The story of your wisdom journey cannot be standardized. It is unique to you, your relatives, and to the woods where you walk. This apprenticeship with complexity is an arduous and evocative journey with many twists and turns, peaks and valleys. Your helpers will guide you if you listen to them. They will sit with you in grief and in joy. Sometimes when you walk in brush amongst trees, you might get scratched by the branches. The journey is not always smooth when you are making a pathway for the future. You might stumble. You must persevere even if you fall down, advise Eleanor and Bert. You will see the helpers in 3D and hear them in stereo. Healing a system will begin with healing self. Hang your colors high in the trees. Introduce yourself to Aki, land, and to Nabish, water, so that they know who you are. I have 7 colors and I met 7 beings on my walk in the woods of complexity. And remember, if you lose your way, go to a high place and look for your relatives. They will guide you home. Thank you to the kindred spirits who shared their gifts with us on this collective wisdom journey as we developed and prototyped iterations of this work. Illustration by Ocean Kiena, the design and project support team from the Greater Good Studio, and friends of mine that provided feedback to the prototype. And this is available through Creative Commons license. And so I'd like to share with you what led to that story, because it's fairly simple and simultaneously very complex in what it's teaching us. As most of our stories are, when you hear the stories from the elders, it will sit with you, of course, and it will revisit you in non-linear time. You will hear stories and teachings that help something make sense from 10 years ago in your life. And then 20 years from now, you'll say, that's what that elder was telling me when I sat around the fire with them. And that they were teaching me something that kind of only makes sense now. So I'm going to just briefly share with you the story of how I got to actually that point of being able to share a story like that online with you. So this is the story behind the scenes of Niigani Miinigowiziiwin. We give these gifts to the future. And so I'm honored to be here as part of this conversation series, in particular as part of sharing Anishinaabe, Gik, and Dasiwin, which is our original ways of knowing. So we say in English sometimes Indigenous knowledge. So these are some important principles in Anishinaabe Miwin to remember as I share this story. And these are what guided me as I did my own studies in sustainability science. And so Gadina Windamin, this concept is very familiar, I think, to most Indigenous peoples around the world, but certainly here in Turtle Island, North America. This idea of we are all related, we are all relatives. On the West Coast, Mr. Atleo talks about, we are all one. In Lakota, my colleague Teokasin Ghost Horse talks about Mataku Ayasin. And so this is this idea that our organizing system and how we make sense of reality is through a kinship system. And so that separation that happens in science and that also happens in the English language doesn't happen. So we're somewhat in this way protected from an anthropocentric bias. We don't, when we say for everyone or we are all related, we don't just mean the human beings. It's not human centric. We actually mean all of our relatives. So the non-humans, the animals, the water, the sun, the moon, the stars, they're all referenced as relatives and actually have names. Like sun for us in Niigani is Numishomis Gizis, which is grandfather sun. Grandmother moon is Nokomis Debik Gizis. And so you see that kinship in our language and how we express that relationship to each other. Another important idea here is bindigo da de win, to enter one another's lodge. And so this is a principle that Jerry Fontaine writes about in his work. But I like this idea because we're often, when we as Anishinaabe people go to university, we're entering someone else's lodge. That's not a teaching lodge that we created. It doesn't really reflect, our potentially our way of learning, our different ways of knowing the world. And so we have to prepare to enter one another's lodge. And how do we do that in a good way? The way that it can be described in Anishinaabe is Nawi Aki, which middle ground. Aki is land or ground. Shkakamakwe is Mother Earth, and so Aki is in there as well. And so middle ground is that space between. And so Cree scholar Willie Ermine, he talks about ethical space. My uncle Dan Longboat, who's Mohawk, Haudenosaunee, he talks about sacred space and the space in between, which is where some of my doctoral studies took me. And then I saw on the website at the University of Calgary this idea of walking parallel paths together in a good way. And that this is what I was trying to do when I was studying Western science, Eurocentric science, and sustainability, complexity, systems thinking, systems dynamics, that embedded within all of those approaches was a more European way of thinking, but it was presented as universal, and that became an issue for me. So here's a beautiful quote from John Mohawk that kind of summarizes what I was trying to do in my dissertation, is that we have people now who are very clearly among the best scientists who are willing to agree that there are limits to the knowledge that science can have about nature. We're reaching a place in which there's ever wider agreement that poetry gives us as much information about our relationship with the universe as telescopes do, and that those two strains can live together and complement one another harmoniously. Those two things can happen, and that's actually not dissimilar to my culture, he says, which asserts that on the one hand, there are dreams and visions, and on the other hand, there's a responsibility to maintain a clear vision of reality. Those two streams of thought and reactions have to live cooperatively together. And so my spiritually adopted uncle, Dan Longboat, who's Mohawk from Six Nations and a professor at Trent University, he introduced me to the work of the late John Mohawk. He always gets a kick out of the fact that he's Seneca, but his name is John Mohawk. And this quote really summarizes for me what I was trying to do in some of my work on decolonizing systems thinking. So when I was studying sustainability science, it's really influenced heavily by resilience thinking, by C.S. Hollings, an ecologist, and Walker and Salt. And during my studies, I was given this definition of resilience, which is the capacity of a system to absorb disturbance and reorganize so as to retain essentially the same function, structure, and feedbacks, to have the same identity. So resilience of complex social ecological systems, like a lake, for example, there's a lack of resilience if that lake, when I think about when we almost killed Lake Erie here, the Great Lakes, when it flips into something else that's unrecognizable. So it reaches a tipping point and then it flips into something we don't recognize as a lake anymore, like a desert. So that's the definition I was given. But I reached out to two language speakers, to my cousin Renee Mashaki and to my sister Eleanor Skeed. I gave them that definition, and this is when I was writing my comprehensive exam. And so that exam, I was given a question and I had 21 days to write a 10,000 word response looking at 3 areas of scholarship, including traditional ecological knowledge. But all of the material I was reading suffered from the same anthropocentric bias, particularly because English is a language of domination and of separation. And so Tiokasin Ghost Horse, my friend, often talks about English as the nounification of the world or the thingification of the world. And when we thingify a river, it's easier for us to think of it as something separate from us, that it's no longer, the way we think about it as a relative. So my cousin Renee said, it's Sibiskaga, Sibe River, Biska flexible, God it is. You might say that resilience is described as a river flowing flexibly through the land. Eleanor said it's Mama Sinjige, the act of twists and turns and moves. Mama Sinjawan is the water flow in twisting and turning. There always has to be context with Ojibwe words, like you need to introduce how the word is being used. I thought it was beautiful that it was 2 elders in 2 different locations, in 2 different dialects, but both came back to me with this interpretation of resilience as a river about the twists and the turns. And Eleanor said, while I was writing my comps exam, are you near a river? And I was outside of Waterloo. I was beside the Nith River, and it was spring, ice melt. And she said, well, that river is teaching you. You should bring your medicine bundle, your pawagan, which is my pipe, and you should bring some food and thank her because she's teaching you what resilience is. And so in my comps, I thanked the river as essentially a co-writer of my paper. And this was another word that I was, hearing, and it sounded like how I would describe systems transformation work and complexity. Jimisawa Bandaming, positive window shopping for your future, which I thought is a beautiful way to describe systems transformation work. I asked my sister Eleanor about this word, and she said, when I hear that, to me it reminds me of looking at the pastry and goodies behind the glass and hoping for them when I was a kid. But it also implies a plan to buy them too. So it's like, let's show him or her so he or she could wish. Jimis is to desire for, to wish. So it is like window shopping too. And so that's how I would describe some of the transformation work, like social innovation labs and change labs and collective wisdom journeys that I lead as a consultant right now. I do quite a bit of that. Another teaching, this comes from Sandra Indigan, actually from Onigaming, in some work we're doing right now on storytelling. We're working with some folks in Treaty 3 who are tackling what we call a wicked problem, which is the opioid crisis in our communities. And we're losing someone almost every week, or 2 or 3 people a week in our communities to the fentanyl overdoses. And so she said this word, and I had heard this word before, wasa nabada, we look in all directions. But in my colonized mind, I had only one idea of directions, the 4 directions, north, south, east, west. And Sandra said, oh yeah, that seems like that's what that means. But no, wasa nabada means we look to the 7 generations before us, to the 7 generations yet to come, and our current generation. And you hold that nonlinear time simultaneously. And so wasa nabada is another one of the principles that kind of, underlies my work. And the guiding question for how I'm approaching this in both my studies and in the work I do is making meaning together in radically different ways. And what does that look like? Through storytelling and through quite a bit of yarning. Yarning comes from our brothers and sisters in Australia. I've been taught how to steward yarns. They're cultural conversations for transmitting knowledge. And so my friend Tyson Young-Comporta has taught me how to yarn, and Auntie Vicky Charles has taught me how to yarn. And I yarn with elders, which is really having tea and sharing stories. And it really invites metaphor, and it's generative. So it's not like a debate, and it's a little bit less structured than our sharing circles. And so I mentioned I was living in Southern Ontario and near Niagara Falls. So I reached out to my Uncle Dan Longboat and I said, I'm studying systems. In fact, I was writing a paper. I was invited by colleagues of mine, a gentleman named Peter Senge, who wrote The Fifth Discipline, and Otto Scharmer, who wrote Theory U. I met them at a workshop called the Executive Champions Workshop, where I'm now faculty, which is delivered in Vermont. And I was writing a paper about systems with Peter and Otto, and my Uncle Dan Longboat said, well, if you're talking to those systems thinkers, you need to talk to ours too. And so he gathered some Haudenosaunee language speakers and knowledge keepers, jokingly called the Haudenosaunee Intelligentsia, and they started to teach me about where I was living at the time, which was in Haudenosaunee Confederacy territory, and the Tua Wampum Belt, one of the original treaties. So this Tua Wampum Belt you see here is the river of life, with the 2 vessels that are sharing that river of life. So those white sacred wampum shells are the river of life. The 2 columns in the middle, the purple columns of those shells, are the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois birch bark canoe and the Dutch merchant sailing ship. And this was the original treaty of how they would share the river of life, and it was equal but differentiated. And there was to be no interference, but settler colonialism and the violation of these treaties, is common across Turtle Island, and it happened with the Dutch and later the French and the British. And so I took the teachings that I was gifted from the Haudenosaunee elders and wrote this paper, Relational Systems Thinking. That's how change is going to come from our Earth Mother. And that was written with Dan Longboat, Diane Longboat, Kevin Deere, and Rick Hill, along with Peter Senge and Otto Scharmer. And it was published in the inaugural issue of the Journal of Awareness-Based Systems Change. And then a year later, I published the second paper, Relational Systems Thinking, the Miinigowiziiwin story of re-theorizing systems thinking and complexity science. I wrote the paper in a 2-row visual code. I had discovered a Mohawk poet who wrote like this, and because I was limited by English, I was limited by the typical, kind of design of an academic journal. I thought from the beginning, I want people to shift their consciousness to cross a threshold. So this represents, John Mohawk when he talked about 2 streams of consciousness being held simultaneously. Can we do that when we read this? It also represented side-by-side stories by different people from different cultures, the Mohawk elders, and then my colleagues, the systems thinkers at MIT. This was, you might say, a rhetorical device, but it was actually also an opportunity for people to sit with the discomfort of how do you read a paper like this. So the last data that I had that was shared with me is it's been downloaded, that first journal article, 23,000 times. And I've presented it at all kinds of international forums to talk about the civilizational shift from what my friend and brother Otto calls from egocentric to ecocentric thinking. And that often when we're pursuing systems change, we're really just upgrading apps on our phone. We need to upgrade the whole operating system. So that's what large-scale systemic change looks like. And so I developed a model that I've been sharing with folks. Relational systems thinking was the name of the paper. So this idea of relational systems thinking as a dynamic interface, theoretical living model for reasoning in the sacred space between ways of knowing. So that comes back to this idea of Uncle Dan talking about the sacred space between ideas, Willie Ermine's work, two-eyed seeing, which is Albert and Merdina, the late Merdina Marshall's work. And the fact, I guess, the invitation that these are often presented as dichotomies or as binaries. And it's an invitation to transcend binary thinking and to also transcend hierarchical thinking, because they're often presented as one is superior to another. And so I did this little diagram kind of also to look like a wampum belt. So on the right, Anishinaabe, Miinigowiziiwin, our pursuit of the good life, which is what our whole life is about here on Mother Earth. Then systems thinking in the West, which kind of rediscovered irreducible wholeness as a response to science, to the reductionist thinking of science, the compartmentalization, breaking everything down to the to the atom, and so there was general systems theory and these different sort of teachings and models that I use, like nonlinearity, living systems, etc., deep ecology. And in the middle is this idea of the river of life, which is herself now in jeopardy, says my Uncle Dan. So it behooves us to find a way to move beyond this binary thinking and to reason synergistically in the space between and accept the gift of multiple ways of knowing instead of rejecting it as, oh, that doesn't, I'm not familiar with that. That makes me uncomfortable. I don't know enough about it, so therefore just completely reject it. Instead, to inhabit a third space in between that's both spiritual, that's all holistic, spiritual, mental, physical, and emotional, that you tap into those frequencies. And it's a focus on healing self and systems. And so tea as a relational methodology, tea and medicine, I've found to be really good mashgiki for the type of work that I do. So I take people on the land and have tea. This relational systems thinking in the space between, it's an interface, a space and place that cultivates a complexity pattern of thinking. The energy in the space between is a magical source of creation. So it's like where the fresh water and the salt water come together. And the medicine, the mushkiki that helps us with that in my friend Tyson Yunkaporta's work, who's Aboriginal from Australia, he talks about eel medicine. And so the eel can go into salt water and fresh water. And so he gifted me something that he created that has an eel carved on it, an eel carving. And so I think about eel medicine as part of, so eel mushkiki and eel story as part of my medicine bundle in doing this systems thinking work. Often when we come to university as Anishinaabe people, there's a cultural clash or conflict in which our epistemologies, our ways of knowing, cosmologies, are presented in educational institutions as inferior or not actually even included. And so this here is Sami scholar Kuokkanen, who talks about the gift, the logic of the gift of Indigenous knowledge. And so she says, Kuokkanen says, the cultural clash or conflict, which I don't know Kuokkanen's first name, is an expression that is being used to describe a situation where Indigenous scholars and students in educational institutions, which are predominantly Western European in their intellectual and philosophical traditions, are faced with a set of values, views, and expectations that differ in several critical ways from their own. And that space between can also, as well as I think of it very optimistically as a space of great potential, but it's also a space of pain. It can be traumatizing to show up in a university classroom and share your knowledge only to have it dismissed or diminished. This beautiful book, Deer and Thunder, Indigenous Ways of Restoring the World, is written by an Andean elder, Arkan Lashwala. And here he's talking about how his language doesn't have the feminine and masculine pronouns the way that we do in English. And so he says that because of that, his language, I can now practice a way of reasoning that does not take sides, but instead allows two opposites to dance together until the face of a third present starts showing up. I thought, well, that's kind of a beautiful way to describe what I was trying to do with relational systems thinking. And so I was recently a systems thinker in residence with a global philanthropy, and for 4 months at the end of 2022, and they gifted me a writing retreat. I spent that retreat actually with Tyson Yunkaporta and his family in Niagara Falls and wrote this paper, Duck Shit Tea, Yarning and the Magical Space in Between Things, which was about when different Anishinaabe cultures, Indigenous cultures come together and how we experienced that time together. We drank tea, the gift giving and the sharing that we did. Tyson's book, Sand Talk, How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World, introduces us to different mindsets. It's a beautiful story, and he's a carver, so that's a boomerang. So he gifted me a woman's fighting stick and the eel carving I talked about, and that's shared in that story. So those two papers that I shared a bit earlier and this one are the 3 papers that are part of my manuscript for my dissertation. So 3 published papers. Then I had an opportunity as part of that residency to work with Greater Good Studio, which is a human-centered design firm in Chicago. And I was working on this. I was working with the 7 grandfather teachings in Anishinaabe, which is on the outside. I was working with the medicine wheel, which is the north, south, east, west, the white, red, black, and yellow, which is our 4 sacred colors. This is a common teaching and I guess a pedagogical heuristic that's very common in Anishinaabe and other areas. And then I had identified like 14, I called them principles that I had interacted with, like the principle of biskabiing, returning to ourselves, the middle ground, threshold, the space between, Miinigowiziiwin, the leaf that we drink tea, or Nibishabo. And so I started to work with this design firm to create what we were just calling a visual communication tool. And I wanted to do it in a decolonized way. So I yarned with elders, with Eleanor Skeed and Bert Landon. That's the team. We had a design session, which was really kind of fun. I've never done that before, where they ask you what feels like 150 questions about what you're trying to do in the world. And then we hired Ocean Kiana, an artist, and she started to look at the work that I was doing. And so Greater Good Studio, based on my feedback, gave her these 3 prototypes. So the medicine wheel you can see is featured in each of them. And it was a focus on relational systems thinking. And that remained central because I thought, well, I've, written these articles and I've introduced this term, people are quoting it, I'm giving guest lectures about it. I must be developing a relational systems thinking complexity modeling framework. That's what I thought I was doing. But then when Ocean Kiana came into my circle to work on this, she brought back her interpretations, her artistic renderings. And the first one featured a lodge, the second one a woman dreaming, the third one a story circle, which was based on something we had showed her that I liked. And she started to present these different images to us. This is me and my husband Sly with Eleanor and Bert in Treaty 3. And the framework went from a model to a story. First it was Miinigowiziiwin. I knew it wasn't Adzukan, it wasn't a traditional legend, but I thought it was Miinigowiziiwin, a personal story. And then in yarning, Bert and Eleanor said, well, no, it's Gakikwewanan, which is a teaching with a life lesson. And the principles went from 14 to 7, and they went from principles to the beings you meet on the journey. And I was hosting people online and taking them in a walk in the woods at my brother Keith Busnow's place. So I took them to our fasting lodge, where families have sugar camps. I took them to the sweat lodge and just showed them, and we lit the Ishkodeh, the sacred fire. And I was hosting a lot of different groups online. And I said, well, if you're really going to understand complexity, it's like going on a walk in the woods, and it's the beings you meet along the way. And I shared that with Ocean and the Greater Good team. And so she came back with these images. And then she came back with this sketch and this sketch. And so this is how Niigani Miinigowiziiwin started to come to life. One of the critical teachings that Eleanor shared was that Anishinaabe, Gik, and Daswin, our original ways of being and knowing, cannot be standardized. And that was really critical for me because I was trying to create a model in the Western sense that, oh, this is something that a professor can take and show, and but then I was alarmed because I saw a website that said, here's the systems thinking models that we use, and they listed about 12 models. And I thought, well, that somehow lacks the complexity of what I was trying to share. And so maybe I'm not doing that medicine wheel complexity modeling framework. Instead, I'm telling a story that's an invitation for people. And so I resisted the pull to standardize my work. And so this is the final illustration. We give these gifts to the future, which I created as a digital flip book online. And the final thing I'll share about the story is that this image and the final story are not included in the final chapter of my dissertation. And it's because I wanted to respect that the story was a living being, cognizant of the fact it was being told. That story is alive for us. As Bert said in the story itself, it becomes a teaching that's gifted from generation to generation. And Eleanor said, it's mushkiki, it's medicine. And so this really is, the gift that I was able to create and share with folks. And so just in the last minute here of some of my time, I'd like to share with you the video of Ocean and how she created this work. And there's no sound, so don't worry if you don't hear anything. There's no sound with this video, but this just gives you a little bit more of I think an adventure along with Ocean and myself into how she created this art. And so those little white flowers are actually, that's Labrador tea from my home territory. And we wanted to acknowledge the tea that comes from our different nations. Like I know there's mint tea out there in Treaty 7, and we have cedar tea here. So to wrap up, I'll just share that, I was pretty committed to those 4 sacred colors until Eleanor said, well, what's your relationship with those 4 colors? And I thought, oh, well, I say them and I talk about them and I've seen them. And she says, well, what are your colors? And I have 7 colors. So in our culture, we have colors and we have different numbers. I happen to have 7 colors. And so Ocean did that drawing of the skirt, and then she made me that skirt. She's a fashion designer. So I wear that skirt and it has my clan, and I wear it in different places. And so the decolonizing of science for me, that was it. That, that kind of 8-minute story is 7 years of work, of studying, of quoting all kinds of Indigenous scholars, of critiquing TEK as being defined in a compartmentalized way, in a reductionist way, of holistic thinking, and of the power of storytelling, but particularly the importance of our languages. Even though I don't speak fluently, I'm always yarning, or I'm in conversation with our language speakers. And it's really a beautiful way, if you want to call it a methodology, to learn, because encoded in our languages is ancestral teachings that are thousands, of generations old. And so we think potentially that it was less complex before modernity and capitalism and this nation state and all of the big problems we're addressing now. But I see in our languages and on the land a complexity mindset. And I'm not really trying to put a Western concept on it. I just think it is. It's complex, it's kinship, it's systems oriented. And so yeah, I'm a systems geek and complexity scholar, and I use a lot of that, a lot of those tools for systems sensing and diagnostics and models, but also storytelling. And I'll share one last thing, is that storytelling is important. And our communities are sharing stories of all kinds of different, wisdoms. And that it's very hard work to do systems transformation, because the systems that are very robust and resilient may produce undesirable outcomes, but they have found a way to self-organize and push back against innovation and against those that are trying to change it. Sometimes it's the actors, and as human beings, we tend to think of, the bad guy. But what systems and complexity does is it invites us to transcend that binary thinking of good and bad, and think about the space in between, and what are we doing so we don't get as polarized in the debates around things. And so the clients that I work with include a number of different folks that come from backgrounds like science, health, law, education, and are tackling these wicked problems. And so this is how I teach systems, is through stories like the one I just shared with you. So Miinigowiziiwin, thank you for listening. Miwe.
Wow, thank you, Melanie, for such a powerful and dynamic presentation. And a special thank you for offering such a beautiful story to start off your webinar, and the incorporation of the power of language, but also the power that stories hold, and the knowledge and the wisdom that comes from these stories that are related and connected to our ancestors, but also all of our relatives that you speak of in this story. I was just reflecting a little bit on your video that you shared at the end, and how complex everything appeared for me, in terms of bringing all those pieces and all those parts together, and thinking about that principle of trust, and trusting the process, as we saw the end result in the illustration, the beauty that complexity can bring, and the teachings that come with that. And as you shared in the illustration, the tea, and the teachings and the stories around the tea, and the medicinal purposes of tea itself, I found that very impactful for myself in terms of trust, because we often fear change. We often doubt the process. But there's so much to gain within the complexity of the process. And I often hear elders speak to me around trusting the process and trusting like things will happen accordingly, things will happen the way it should happen. We host a lot of events, we host a lot of programs, and we often have a barrier of stress and doubt and fear and all those complex emotions that come in to kind of pull us off from that direction in terms of moving forward. So those are some of the thoughts that were going through my mind. But I'm wondering about kind of your mind in terms of navigating all this. Was trust something that you had conversations with yourself in terms of trusting the process and navigating through not only your Anishinaabe worldview, but also the systems, especially the Western systems and the Western thinkers in terms of moving this work forward?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a great question, and I did even when I shared in the slide deck, my first model with the medicine wheel, and I was determined to develop a complexity modeling framework. And then when Ocean came back and there was no medicine wheel in any of her initial drawings, my first reaction was, oh no, the artist doesn't get what I'm trying to do. And she's a very young, talented artist, and I thought, well, maybe this is, because in complex adaptive systems and complexity science, we always talk about the principle of emergence, which is non-linearity. And so we're accustomed and socialized to think in linear ways, A then B then C. And we don't think about, Z. And I mean, you hear about this in Jurassic Park, chaos theory, and the butterfly flaps its wings and it rains, around the world somewhere else. This idea of non-linearity, that's what that is. And so the emergence of, when it was actually, I think, Ocean who said, well, these are the beings you meet in the lodge. And one of her first drawings was this, the sweat lodge or a teaching lodge. And then I was hosting folks on the land, and a colleague of mine did a reflection exercise on Zoom. And as we walked through the woods, she said, who are the beings that you meet along the way when you're doing your work in systems change? And I thought, yes, well, we always talk about beings and helpers in the Miinigowiziiwin. And so I let go of, and it was difficult to let go of, the model idea, the principles, because I knew that in academics, people would be looking for a model and principles and how do I apply this, but also standardization. As soon as Eleanor said that on one of our yarns, and I yarned with the elders for maybe 2 hours each time, about 6 or 8 times, to come up with, that story where I would show them a new line or something I had written. And they both talked about healing, and they said what our stories are, what our ceremonies give us, what our dreams give us. I think you hear Bert say that in the story, is it's always a gift and it's for healing. And so, this idea of healing isn't only after colonization. Like, we appreciated the role of healing before the trauma of colonial genocide, because we had tough lives on Mother Earth, with the elements. And so the elders remind us that those healing journeys didn't just start with colonization, but they really became important after colonization. So I had to trust the process of working with an artist and also respect an artistic view of how to do systems change work. And now I often start different projects with saying, if there are no artists involved, we're going to really struggle, because the artists transcend language. And so even if you're working in multiple language, like, in areas, I'm fortunate here because I'm working primarily in Anishinaabe, but I do have Haudenosaunee, Mohawk words in the first paper, as taught to me by the Mohawk elders. And that was a real gift. My Uncle Dan calls it cultural fluency. And he says, Anishinaabe people, we should learn from each other as well. So it's not always Western and Indigenous. It's, it's Cree and Anishinaabe and Mohawk. And so I've had the opportunity to yarn with elders from different, like Leroy Little Bear, and others who have taught me so much, especially at the nexus of science and trusting, and I'll just share this little kind of anecdote is when I was in one of my courses at UW, we're talking about dissertation formats, and I was giving examples in that seminar of different dissertation formats, like plays, novels. I said there was a scholar at OISE who came from a long line of quilters, and I was thinking about star blankets, and she did a quilt with 12 panels and 12 chapters. And my professor said, well, there will be no quilts here. And it was, my program's a very standard academic science, literature review, publications, and there was no room for that. And so when I shared Duck Shit Tea, which is really more of like a narrative, and it's on the Wolf Willow website, I shared that with my supervisor, and he said, well, that should go in your dissertation. So there's, progress being made. And even when I was initially writing my dissertation and I was, speaking with, a dozen or so elders, a committee member said, well, maybe you should talk to more. Like it was all and I said, talking to one elder is in itself, whatever you call it, what's the word, valid, and then, you should talk to 50 elders. And so I pushed back against that. And I also pushed back against the elders as in terms of the ethics approval, because I said, if you don't have to get ethics approval to talk to university professors, and I'm offering the elders sema, tobacco, and I'm sitting with them in circle and having tea, then that's the ethical, that's all the ethics I need. And so the ethics committee at UW approved that. And so, I'm still fighting battles where some universities have come a long way, and but I think even universities that have had Indigenous studies programs for like 50 years, like Trent, are still, dealing with this systemic nature of the clash that comes with different ways of knowing. So yeah, I definitely, had to trust the artistic process in this case, that I could present something that would hopefully be of value for people, and that I would share it freely on my website, that it's not something you have to buy, it's not presented in an academic journal, that it's just there and available for folks.
Thank you for sharing that gift with all of us and having that available to us. We have some comments and questions coming in, so I'm just going to read off some questions here. So the first question, Melanie, speaking of entering each other's lodges, are there places of learning that you would recommend to students to try to attend in what we currently call Canada?
I think, there's the tangible aspect of lodge. So there are teaching lodges now. I think there are spaces at different universities where they've set up teaching lodges, and they're running very robust, whether it's called reconciliation or indigenization, they have guest speakers. And so there's the physical going to a lodge, but there's also, the metaphor of to enter another's lodge and to experience a different worldview. I think the somatic experience is really important, like physically going somewhere and doing something. So if there's immersive, I think I'm thinking of the Canadian Science Centers and the museums, which are on their own decolonizing and reconciliation journey and working with Indigenous artists and art galleries and places like that, where you can get at least an introduction, to different ways of knowing. There's obviously some really beautiful books that have been written, but there's also then the ceremonial lodges, and that's really up to the protocols of the local nations and elders. I've found for Anishinaabe, our elders are very welcoming to folks because they, appreciate that someone has taken the time to journey there and to be a part of ceremony. And also the idea of a medicine bundle. So Niigani, Miinigowiziiwin, we give these gifts to the future, is also about Miinigowiziiwin, which is our sacred knowledge bundle. Miinigo, that which is given to you, is Iziiwin from somebody else. So the invitation to enter another's lodge is that you are also gathering items for your sacred knowledge bundle. And that's actually how I ask people to introduce themselves when we're on Zoom, is not through kind of their typical credentials and, you know, what they would share normally, their title, etc. But to tell me about their Miinigowiziiwin and the beings they've met along the way. And it's really beautiful because people from all over the world have introduced themselves and been invited to bring their authentic and full self. And so that's a little bit of the metaphorical way of entering another's lodge. So yeah, so I think within, you know, society and civil society, that there's different types of lodges that you can reach out to, but certainly at universities, the Indigenous, you know, engagement office and programs like that are now giving us more opportunities. We have here locally is Algoma University, and it's on the site of an old residential school, Shingwak Residential School, and across is Shingwak Hinomajgamik, and it's a full teaching lodge. It's a brand new facility with classrooms, and they do community engagement. So I think there's more opportunities that existed than when I was young to go and, you know, meet and learn from others and their culture. And they'll teach you the protocols of how to do that in a good way too, locally.
Thank you, Melanie. Another question we have is, can you share any advice on how universities can center Indigenous ways of knowing to increase the potential of that space in between Indigenous ways of knowing and Western science?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges when we talk about systems transformation. So if we look at reconciliation or indigenization and decolonization as a wicked problem, then it has a systemic nature. And so understanding and sensing into those systems dynamics, one of the first entry points to doing that work that we talk about in systems is mental models. So mental models are anything from kind of an assumption about reality to a big ideology. And it's how we make meaning in the world. And it's the reason that it's a really powerful leverage point to intervene in a system is because mental models are often hegemonic, and so we don't challenge them. They're kind of just accepted. We're socialized to think in a certain way. And so in universities, I consult with a number of different universities on their indigenization strategies. And I say the first thing we're going to do is sense making and meaning making. And so we go through a number of activities. One of them is 3D systems mapping. It's where I ask folks from across the university to start mapping what the system looks like if it's colonial right now, right? And what that looks like. Then we map the system, and we use toys and art and a number of different, you know, kind of tactics to help people envision and visualize what they think the system looks like right now. And so what that does is it helps us understand that emergence. And so often I think what universities do is we try to think ourselves into the solutions. We try to think of ideas, and it's all very cerebral and intellectual, and that's useful, but it's about balance, right? So bringing in play, song, performance. We do Qigong, which is an Eastern practice like Tai Chi, because a lot of trauma resides in those systems as well. And so, like I said, the work of doing systems change on the ground is really difficult work. So I work with elders, and we have ceremony. And I think that's a really key aspect of it, is having a bundle and doing ceremony and asking the Manidug, which is in the story, to petition the spirits there to help with that. And so the first thing that Sandra Indian told us when we were tackling the opioid crisis, as an example, is that we all need a medicine bundle, particular to that, not just the medicine bundle that you already have, but particular to that goal, right? And then the spirits that will help you, and you will be gifted. So when I was gifted the turtle rattle, this Miigwech Shishiguan, the instructions were to have it be red on the left for the heart, white on the right side for the mind. There's 13 Manidug spirits in there. And this red actually comes from Stoney Nakoda territory. From a young person there, I was telling this story, and she gave me this, you know, what they paint their horses and faces with. And then the Manidug are from a place of Animiki, lightning, an Old Woman Bay. And so the handle is made by wood struck by lightning. And so the adzukan, the traditional legend of this, is that you shake it for healing. And this is the first sound we heard in our creation story when Creator made Anishinaabe people and Skakamakwe. And so this helps me do the work because it helps me balance between heart and mind. So the intellect and also the spirituality, and that there's intellect and spirit in both. That's what the elder said. So in universities, I think it's really helpful to have the elders come in and do those teachings and to gift the bundles and gift the songs, you know, that are part of that particular work. Because someday, in 2 or 3 generations, this will be an old bundle and an old teaching, you know, for 3, 4 generations to come. Miigwech.
Thank you, Melanie. We have a lot of questions coming in. The next one we have is, in your story, you share that in a journey towards systems change, we are the helpers, our ancestors walk with us. Unique to you, your relatives, and the ancestors that walk with us. For anyone who may not be in touch with their culture, do you have any tips on how to get started?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a fairly common question in the work I do around the world for either Indigenous folks that are not connected because of colonialism to their culture, and non-Indigenous folks who are far removed from their ancestors and don't have access, you know, to their elders. And so one of the, I think, in terms of healing, one of the things to do is to, you know, start to look at learning from the stories of elders and seeing if there is a connection and finding that connection and reaching out to those local elders. And if not, there's other teachings in complexity that speak to ancient traditions. And so we can, without appropriating, you know, different cultures, we can appreciate different cultures and read about that. And so we've incorporated, like I said, Qigong, and Tai Chi, which is an Eastern practice, you know, a gift from our relatives in the East and the West, to the West here. So the connection, I think, is when we feel that loss, when you feel that grief, that's your spirit, you know, wanting to reconnect with something like that. But Skakamakwe, you know, actually Arkan Lashwala talks about that. He talks about re-indigenizing the world. And he's not talking about the kind of, you know, political term indigenous, like as in the United Nations. He's talking about that we're all indigenous to Mother Earth, and that's the work of elders. So I heard, or the message of elders, there's an elder I work with that from Akuya from Alaska, and he said, the most unselfish thing we can do right now is heal ourselves. And so I think that, you know, going on a healing journey and recognizing it as such, because the multi-generational trauma of disconnecting from Mother Earth, of modernity and of capitalist society, I think we all feel an intense grief, and a connecting to Mother Earth is so important. And that can be done through walking, like even just a practice of walking, which sounds so simple. Like it's like, well, yeah, I go for a walk, but no, to be present. And so we did an audio garden actually, where we invited people to take a walk, and they could bring, I guess, me on I don't know, on their earphones with them. And I said, be conscious of the time of day. You know, is it morning, afternoon, evening? Are you looking at the northern lights? And, you know, what's the season? And I think a lot of us are really disconnected from that way of life because we have those things that keep us separated because we have grocery stores, so we're not hunting and fishing. And so right now it's Ziguan, it's spring, and it's maple water, and so we have our letting go ceremony, and just, I think, being connected to the seasons and what the local teachings are from the nations locally is a beautiful place to start. And more they're going online. You can find it online, and you can read about it in some beautiful books by Indigenous authors. But I would say that for all cultures, it is part of re-indigenizing to Mother Earth. You know, reconnecting to Mother Earth is so important. It's a really beautiful place to start that journey.
Thank you so much for that response. The next question, how do you see this kind of complex language-based teachings being brought into organizations and institutions that have those ingrained westernized standards of practice?
Yeah, that's something that I've been experimenting with, because as a consultant right now, I'm working with a group in Los Angeles, California, whose focus is equity and diversity in the States. They call it JEDI, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And I said, so JEDI work often focuses on policies and those kind of structural and systemic changes, but having more diversity, and Sarah Ahmed, who's a feminist scholar, and she talks about, it's different to have black and brown bodies show up into the room, but then when our epistemology show up with us, we're vilified for that. And so, we want to move beyond that. And so the way that I've been introducing systems and complexity is through those somatic practices, through videos, through stories, and helping people understand the power of language. So with the group just last week in California, they're trying to get equity in terms of access to care for Black and Indigenous peoples who are dealing with substance use disorders, right? So addictions. And what we showed them was the iceberg model, which is a fairly common systems thinking model, where above the iceberg, you see that we're often responding to events. And then below the iceberg are the pattern structures and mental models. But there's another one that shows a tree and all the roots underneath, and it talks a little bit more about agency. And so introducing the complexity language, like the principle of emergence, I do an exercise where I talk about hollow phrases and how many of our Indigenous languages have hollow phrases or relational word bundles, and English doesn't. And I ask people to think of an English word. I did this Friday. Think of an English word that you're attached to in your work, right? And so you hear this in certain departments, in certain institutions, and it's in their mission statement, and they're really connected, but nobody really ever breaks down the mental models and the values in that word. And so I ask people to think of an English word that they're very emotionally attached to in their work that they're doing, and to pretend that that word doesn't exist. Then I put them in pairs on Zoom and ask them to share the story and come back. And this was with a bunch of doctors. And at first they said, they confessed, well, I thought this was kind of silly. Like, what am I doing in this little breakout room talking about? But then they realized that they are kind of attached to like a word like equity, right? Because it means a lot. It's passionate. It's part of their work. It's justice. It's activist work. And accessing a different way of thinking helps them understand the power that they hold within a system as doctors. And so imagine being a doctor, a person of color, fighting to get addictions treatment to underserviced communities, and that's your life's work. You probably don't maybe think of yourself as part of the system that you're trying to transform. You're thinking of the system as over there, and I'm going to fix it. Instead, the invitation in systems and complexity work is to understand that you are a part of the system you're trying to change. And that requires humility. That's why those natural law teachings from our elders are so helpful. So we did that exercise, and then I introduced them to repatterning. So systems and complexity is all about recognizing patterns and then repatterning. And you can repattern something at an individual level, and that gives us agency, because as soon as you do the iceberg model, quite frankly, what happens is people start to look at the mental models, and the big structures are like capitalism. And so how do you, as an individual in one school or one university, take on capitalism? And it can feel quite hopeless. But if you're repatterning aspects of capitalism in your department or in your work, in your course syllabus even, you're introducing people to the hope and the possibility of transcending the binaries that they think they're stuck with. Like, we really do often think we have A or B. We have sustainability or, mass destruction in the Anthropocene. But what's the space in between? And the invitation is just to start thinking about that and have generative conversations about it. So that's how I introduce people to these, kind of complex terms. And then as students, I start using words like adjacent, possible, and basins of attraction, I lose some of the audience. So what I do is I tell those as stories and ask people to recognize patterns. And it's simple. You could ask people to put things in a chat box right now and then ask them to recognize the patterns. What do you notice about what everybody's putting, what is their favorite food? When complexity shows up is when someone says, but I don't have a favorite food, right? And then you start, oh, okay. Well, that's emergence in complexity, because why don't they have a favorite food? And this happened to me once, and I thought, what? How this isn't controversial. And then I found out the person, told me that they were deaf and they don't have a sense of taste or smell. And now we have people with long COVID like that and couldn't relate to food in the same way. So complexity actually opens us up to the medicine of emergence. I consider it a mashkiki. I talk often about the medicine of emergence. And that's the invitation that I give to folks that are fairly well trained in a certain discipline, because it's hard for them to move beyond that, I've found, just because we've had so much education, right? Being trained as a biologist or a chemist or a lawyer, to move beyond that. And story really helps with that. So that's why I explore storytelling as an entry point to doing systems change work. Miigowich.
Thank you, Melanie. I'm thinking about the middle ground, also known as ethical space, and how we come into very complex conversations around reconciliation, decolonization, incorporating Indigenous knowledge into institutions like academia. And I'm thinking also about the 7 sacred teachings. And then you brought up humility in this response. How important is it to have humility, and should humility be applied when coming into what you call the middle ground?
Yeah, I think that, that sacred space or middle ground, now we a key ethical space, that it would be very difficult to actually embody or manifest in that space without humility. And I mean, of course, that, the thing about the 7, we call them the 7 grandfather teachings, some say the 7 grandmother teachings, but another aspect of that is respect. And so to be respectful, I think you have to be humble, and so, and then we have teaching moments where we're taught humility, and it's how you, can you survive, one of those teaching moments where you're taught humility, not only by another human being, but you're often taught humility by the Maniduk, by the spirits, by the helpers, because they need you to pay attention to something. And so, for example, I did a webinar, and it was called the Dialogues on Transforming Self and Society, and it was with Otto Scharmer and Peter Senge. I was at MIT visiting as a guest, and we did this webinar, and 500 people signed up. It sold out, and then I was introducing myself, and I was acknowledging the 4 directions, and I said, Sema Nabagdana Ki Wei Nang Wab Nang Zha Nang Minwa Niigani Nang. And I had a quilt in front of me with the 4 colors, and we had set it up so that it faced the east, but I was facing it from a different direction, and the camera was coming in from a different direction. And I got all confused, and I forgot the western direction, Ninga Bianang. And I went home, and I went back to my hotel that night, and I actually started crying. And I texted Eleanor, and I said, people who don't speak Ojibwe will not know this, but the Anishinaabe speakers, Miinigowiziiwin, will say, oh, but she didn't name that direction. And I felt like it was I did something wrong. And Eleanor said, no, but you're assuming, because of a lack of humility, and this is like the conceit of human beings, that was all about you. Maybe the West didn't want to show up today. Maybe the Western spirit, the great being that sits in that direction, there's a reason. And there's tricksters too, right? That play tricks on you. Like when you're looking for something, it's like, I just had that. So the tricksters that show up, I think that's what they help us with our humility, because we want to be so good, do things in such a good way and not violate any protocols. But if you start from a place of humility, which I find knowledge keepers do, it's so beautiful to see, when you see a group of knowledge keepers with each other. And I think, like in the martial arts, the masters, the old masters are like that as well. They'll be the quiet one sitting in the corner, and then someone else will be up there maybe kind of showboating. And it'll be the most humble person that has the tremendous amount of knowledge and skills. And so I always think about that, if we don't have that humility, it's going to be very difficult to overcome that clash that happens in the space between as well. And there's a term in Spanish that I can't say very well. It comes out of Indigenous Mayan teachings about Nepantla, which is the space in between as a space of pain, and that to come out of the space in between, you often in that space, especially for Indigenous, students maybe at a university, you actually have to shut down part of your identity. And I think we've all done that. We have different social positionalities, and we show up in a space that's not welcoming to that. And so we shut that down, and that becomes a space of, trauma and pain. And so to overcome that, they have 7 steps on a healing journey. And I've thought about that those beings that you meet, for me, that was very healing, because I did stand up in class when I had my first reading list in my PhD on sustainability science, and there was not one Indigenous author, not an ecofeminist, not a Black author. It was all ecological economics and C.S. Hollings and the Brundtland Commission. And while that's all important in the canonical literature of, sustainability and learning about the Anthropocene, it basically showed my classmates that Indigenous peoples had nothing to say about sustainability. So I brought in Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, and I brought in a big braid of sweetgrass. And I stood up in maybe the 3rd class, and I said to my classmates, I hope you don't go through your whole PhD program studying the earth and Mother Earth and sustainability and think that Indigenous peoples have nothing to say or offer. There's scholarship, there's books, there's the land, there's all kinds of places where you can learn about this. And so I handed that around. And one of my professors that night sent me an article about the noble savage trope, and had sort of taken that gift and put it all into, this myth of the ecological Indian, which other Indigenous scholars had already answered. And so I addressed it with that professor, but that was how the gift was not accepted. It was rejected, and it was pushback with, oh, so now it's, everything I offered which was really offered from a place of humility, and as a gift was rejected and sort of categorized as, I was bringing up essentialism and identity politics, I think he called it. And so I thought, how am I going to survive this program? But fortunately, I had a committee and elders that I could reach out to that would help me with each of those challenges. And what Eleanor said is, when you read those papers, like all these science papers, she said, it's like you're twisting into this awkward position, but you don't have to stay there. You can twist into it to understand and then come back out. And that's how she described that decolonizing work, is like, read the paper, understand it, and then come back to our way. And that's how I wrote my, my dissertation. So there is kind of that space between is not only a metaphor, sometimes it's a real place that you inhabit, that you're right there in the room, and you might embody that space in between, because you're the only person of color, or you're the only queer person, or you're the only, Canadian in an American context, whatever it is, you embody something for people, and you have to sometimes just, ask your helpers to be with you. That's what I meant when I said your ancestors walk with you, because it can feel very lonely.
Thank you, Melanie. We're out of time. We have a lot of questions coming in. We have a lot of comments about the wonderful presentation that you had with us today, Melanie. So we're gonna close our webinar, everyone. I apologize for not getting to all the wonderful questions. I believe we can forward those questions to Melanie as well. So we recognize that the journey towards transformation is going to take time, requiring the good hearts and hands of many. We would not be able to do that without the support, guidance, and participation from the diverse communities that we serve. We hope you engage in this journey of transformation by sharing your learnings through meaningful conversations with friends, family, and colleagues. I'll pass it over to Alana Dawn for closing comments.
Yeah, we really encourage everyone to take time to reflect upon the teachings and learnings that Melanie so graciously shared with us today. Some reflection questions we wanted to share is, what learnings are you excited to share with others? What actions might this inspire in you in the spirit of reconciliation? And in reflecting, on the title of Melanie's presentation, we give these gifts to the future. how will you honor these learnings that have been shared, these gifts to the future? So thank you so much, Melanie. A heartfelt thank you. And thank you to Florence. I want to thank Gerald and Lynn. I've really enjoyed working with you for today's event and look forward to continue working together. And yeah, I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon. And I invite like Gerald and Melanie, if you have any final closing thoughts you want to share.
I just want to thank the Office of Sustainability for collaborating in the Indigenous Knowledge Lecture Series. I want to thank Melanie for inviting us earlier on for virtual tea and just having a conversation around today's session. And thank you, Melanie, for all the work that you're doing in your community, for all the wisdom and knowledge that you shared with us here today. Miigwech.
Miigwech, thank you, everyone. As my Uncle Dan Longboat says, when we come together, we light the council fire. And now we don't put out that fire, we let those embers go, and each of us takes an ember with us. So, Apijigo Miigwech Bizindawag, thank you for listening, and Bama P, until later.
Have a good day, everyone.